This and this are not the same game. Both games share a lot of similarities. Similar art style, similar enemies, similar music, even the same name, but they're completely different. One of these games inspires creativity. Vast, open world, empty, extremely varied terrain, bright and saturated colors, a true definition of a sandbox. While the other inspires adventure. Dozens of biomes to explore, dungeons to conquer, dozens of items that serve no other function but to be collected, villagers to interact with and protect, other dimensions to journey through, all leading to a final boss and an end credits. Only after experiencing all of that content does the second game become more of a sandbox. Even after the end credits roll, there are still more dungeons to conquer, still new biomes to explore, new mobs to fight. So how exactly did these two games become so different from one another? I mean, the first game would eventually turn into the second game, so there has to be a turning point somewhere, right? Okay, and obviously I'm not donkey brain, like I understand that these are both the same game, okay? One's a beta version and one's a fully released version. And obviously games that are released during their development are gonna go through some drastic changes. But once you do some deep digging, it's kind of interesting to see the developers change their philosophy and alter the course of the game forever. Let me tell you my earliest memory of Minecraft. I remember I was walking in the store with my mom, and something I always loved to do was go to the magazine section and either grab Game Informer, Xbox magazine, or sometime even PC Gamer. And that was the case this time, because I saw a demo disc attached. And if you were a gamer back then, you would learn to love demo discs. That was so cool to just come home with a brand new game, kinda. And in this particular instance, it was the Minecraft PC Gamer demo. Back then, a game being in early access was definitely not the norm. I know a lot of indie games, they start in early access to try to get the opinions and funding of their small fan base to boost the development and hopefully keep the game alive a lot longer than it would have been otherwise. Having grown up with Legos, playing Minecraft was just the next logical step in my evolution as a child. It was a giant open world where I could build or create anything. Back then, the block palette was very limited and mostly boiled down to the colors of blocks, as opposed to wanting particular blocks to represent every real material in the world. Like seriously, have you guys seen how many blocks are in this game now? Anyway, my point is, this game didn't have any sort of end goal or boss fight, or even really a progression. The only progression you could find is in the tools, and that was about it. It capped out at Diamond. And not even Enchanted Diamond or upgraded to Netherite, nope, just Diamond. That's how I remember Minecraft. It was simple and it was easy to just imagine anything in that world. I remember sharing worlds with friends where we would just create buildings with no sort of function other than pretend that we lived in some sort of community that really existed. I mean, we had taverns built, schools built, hotels built, we even built churches. I didn't even really go to church as a kid. What the f was I building a church for? So having started within the beta days of Minecraft, I began to ask myself, when did it change? Or did it change? Well, when looking into it and digging through old memories of mine, I narrowed it down to 3 major updates. 1 in the beta version, and 2 as a fully released game. Let's start with the biggest major turning point. Beta 1.8, the Adventure Update. Now, I remember when I saw YouTube videos about this update and how it was going to change everything. Hunger, sprinting, critical hits, new dungeons, ravines. Caves were no longer just boring, winding spaghetti paths. There were giant crevices in the ground that you could just fall into and die. While all of those changes sound awesome, it was a pretty big controversial move by Notch and Mojang. If you'll notice, most of these additions that I mentioned line up perfectly with the way I described the second game earlier. Very adventure focused. Before 1.8, players' movement was restricted to a lot slower and more casual pace. Combat was as simple as just point and click. The only dungeon in the game before 1.8 was the little rinky-dink mossy cobble one that sometimes had 2 chests, sometimes had 1, and the only real loot it contained was saddles. I guess you can consider the music discs valuable loot, but there were only 2 at the time, and I don't know, it's alright. Not only was there one dungeon before 1.8, but technically there was only one structure before 1.8, if I'm remembering correctly. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, sorry. In addition to these 2 new dungeons, we also got villages. Despite not having trading yet or loot inside the villages, hell, we didn't even have villagers yet. The addition of villages was still a huge deal. Villages were kind of the first sign that the player wasn't alone in this world. Maybe it wasn't just a giant open sandbox that only you could influence. Now, with all these additions, let's go back to game number 1. Game number 1 I described as more of a sandbox. The player's dropped into an empty world, and the player is given no instruction to do anything in particular. The only goals are the ones the player puts upon themselves. Whereas now in beta 1.8, there are 3 new structures to describe. There are 3 new structures to holy fuck. There were 3 new structures to discover. This included abandoned mine shafts, strongholds, and even villages, as well as a whole new combat system, which won't be the first time they do this, keep that in mind. And I didn't even mention the addition of experience points. All of these new additions don't promote the same core philosophy of being an open sandbox with no goals. These additions are almost entirely contradictory to that original theme. And despite all of those things being huge changes to the game, it doesn't quite compare to the thing that I think changed the game the most in this update. The terrain. The world itself looks different now. I mean, just look at this compared to this. The terrain is now way less varied and a lot more dependent on the biome type. For example, the terrain in pre-beta 1.8 Minecraft had a more free-form and random feel to it. In 1.8, it became way harder to get cool seeds with wacky and creativity-sparking mountains and caves to explore. The terrain just became a lot more predictable. Personally, I remember feeling like I had seen the same mountains, forests, caves, and ravines over and over again. Gone were the days of seeds like these, and here were the days of seeds like these. Oceans were big and endless. No more random bodies of water thrown into interesting bits of terrain. It's also worth noting that the Farlands were removed from this update, which is arguably one of the most iconic parts of Minecraft's beta terrain generation. Now, comparing the terrain changes to the way I described the first game earlier, it's hard to deny that it's a complete contradiction to extremely varied terrain, bright saturated colors. We now have 3 more structures to explore, less saturated colors, and granted the world is still vast and open, but now it feels 90% ocean. I'm a poet and I didn't know it. Sorry. But the point is beta 1.8 was the first time Minecraft felt like it had departed from the old ways of just being a simple sandbox game. It is worth noting that creative mode was also added in beta 1.8, and that is straight up acknowledgement of the fact that it's a sandbox game, but I'm really focusing on the survival mode here. Not only was beta 1.8 a departure from all of the things that previously made Minecraft so unique, but it was also the first time Minecraft felt that it had goals outright imposed on the player. With the terrain being changed and feeling a lot more stale and boring than what it used to be, these new structures were the center of attention. The players now feel more incentivized to go find these new interesting structures. And with these new structures comes something that wasn't really in Minecraft before. These structures now imply that people were here before we were. Something that wasn't really conveyed in beta 1.7.3 and before. With the existence of villages and abandoned mine shafts and even strongholds, the players are led on to believe that there's a deeper meaning to some of these structures and the story already exists, as opposed to earlier versions of Minecraft that were way more focused on being an open sandbox where your stories create the lore of the world. And though this update did make pretty big strides towards being more of an adventure-style game that shared a lot of elements with RPGs, none would be bigger than the next one. Update 1.0. Notice how there's no beta in front of that anymore. This was no longer an early access game. Although looking back at it, it kind of felt like early access still, but I digress. And now, dropping the beta in the name, literally this is not the same game anymore. And you know, there were the obvious changes like potions and nether fortresses, the end dimension, but none were really bigger than these few changes that I'll go into deeper, like villagers for example. This was the first mob since zombies to closely resemble a human/player, if you don't count the Steve mob and the Beast Boy mob and very early versions of the game. But this is just further supporting the hidden lore of abandoned villages from the previous update. The world is no longer empty like it used to be. And with the addition of animal breeding, Minecraft's progression really begins to shift from its original conception. Food is no longer just chasing down stray pigs in the wild for some pork chops. You can now cultivate these animals. I mean, you can pull a capitalistic America and just have huge industrial-sized farms. That is if the Minecraft government doesn't come after you. In which case, then you'll need armor to protect yourself, which this update was great for because armor durability was increased in this update. Before, it was fairly weak and you'd often find yourself replacing broken armor frequently. The durability had been upped to prevent the frequent armor changing, and this promotes something that I like to call character builds. In most RPG games, you find yourself looting dungeons and upgrading your loot constantly. That's kind of the main gameplay loop and for some the main draw. Now with higher durability and the addition of item repairing in the crafting table, you're no longer as precious as you used to be about wearing your diamond armor because you could always just repair it. Gone were the days of wearing diamond armor and knowing that the more damage you take in it, the less time it's really gonna last. And though this really only feels like one step in that RPG character builds style of gameplay, enchanting is what really solidified that. It now adds increased value in your items, and more specifically adds yet another step of progression that leans heavier into being a full RPG. You were no longer seen as rich and powerful if you just had diamond armor because, well, if you don't have the enchant glint, then you're worthless. With armor and tools having been buffed by enchanting and leaning heavier into more of an RPG progression, nothing screams RPG like a boss fight. This is easily the second biggest change in the entire update. I'll get into the first in a sec. From a purely game design standpoint, this now becomes an official goal in a game that supposedly had no goals. This is the first time the world has actually asked a player to participate in something. Having a final boss fight now just confirms that all of these additions to a player progression was amounting to something. This game is truly becoming an RPG. This is no longer just an open sandbox with no goals. And just like an RPG, when a player kills the final boss, they're rewarded with the biggest amount of experience points that any mob can drop in the game. And with me ranking the boss fight as only the second biggest change in this update, what could possibly be bigger than that? If you ask me, this is easily the most integral change in this update. The credits in video games, or any piece of media for that matter, usually serve as a thank you to the player from the developers for playing their game. Most of the time, it's implied that the credits mark the end of an average player's experience. It acts as a sort of bittersweet goodbye. In its nature, the Minecraft credit serves as a goodbye to the player. What started as a game about no goals other than one self-imposed by the players has now turned into a light RPG with little to nothing to actually do other than build along the way. Obviously that's dumbing it down, and the player base at the time was mostly digging this new direction. But despite that, this was still a huge blow to the community in a way that they wouldn't fully realize until much later. And by much later, I mean like 4.5 years later. Everyone probably knows at this point what update I'm about to talk about here. This is the most controversial update Minecraft has probably ever added to the game. Minecraft 1.9, the combat update. This is where the player base really began to distrust Mojang. And if you ask me, Mojang forgot who they used to be with this update. Updates before then had mostly been adding to particular systems that really enforced the sandbox mindset, but also a few changes mixed in that leaned into the RPG side of things. For example, the Wither being added was another boss, Ocean Monument, another dungeon, and villager trading, which is, very RPG type things. I feel like a lot of people cite 1.12 or 1.13 as kind of the beginning of modern Mojang, but honestly, it's most definitely 1.9. I mean, when you look at the features, a full revamp of the end dimension. I use full lightly there. It added some stuff. It made it feel less empty, but at the time, that was fucking huge. a combat revamp. Some people could probably argue it's a devamp. I personally kind of like the changes, but I can see why people like the old system. New crops, a new dungeon, and new key items that further player progression. For example, shields, spectral arrows, lingering potions, tipped arrows, and, of course, the elytra. So why do these features define modern Mojang? One could argue that updates before 1.9 followed a trend of improving existing systems, but here and there we'd get introduced to a brand new thing that changed up the whole game and adds more layers to the Minecraft world. For example, the beacon was a huge addition. I still remember feeling like that was a mod when that snapshot came out. The addition of rideable mounts that you could actually control the direction of. And if you want to even go on the creative side of things, spawn eggs and amplified world generation. Although every update moving forward from 1.9, with the exception of a few that I'll get into later, seek out to revamp and or replace old systems for the new ones that are chasing to fit more of an RPG style of gameplay as opposed to the old school sandbox style from game number 1. To bring it all back around, Mojang wants to improve the game, but lacked the awareness of what the original game was, and has led to a creation of an entirely different game. Now, is it a bad thing that beta versions of Minecraft and modern versions of Minecraft are two entirely different experiences? Well, no, depending on who you ask. Most games find themselves evolving throughout its life cycle. I mean, the biggest example that comes to mind for me is Call of Duty. I used to be a huge Call of Duty fan, but only of the golden era. Nowadays, it's become a shell of its former self and seems to have completely lost touch to what its audience used to like about the older games. What makes Minecraft a different case in the evolving game theory, what's up, my pet, is the original developer has been absent, and so the original intention for the game's systems have been outgrown to favor something different. In a world where digital media is being wiped from the internet by their parent companies, let's just be thankful that Mojang has allowed us to access these older versions with virtually no hiccups. It would be absolutely tragic if Microsoft stopped allowing us to access these older versions of Minecraft and only forced their new versions on us. But what if I don't want to have to play the older versions of Minecraft in order to get that old school sandbox experience, I hear you asking? I mean, will Minecraft's dev team ever find itself back in that sandbox mindset? Well, as I kind of hinted towards earlier, there have been a few updates that have broke the mold of replacing old features in favor of pursuing a more RPG style of game. The Caves and Cliffs update is a huge example of that. Now, I get that its entire ordeal was replacing old systems, but it wasn't an effort to pursue a more RPG style of game at all. It seemed like more of a response to the community at the time and kind of an effort to flip the conversation about modern Minecraft terrain. The world height had been increased, the world depth was increased, and the overall generation of terrain was a lot more varied and awe-inspiring like it used to be. I know for me personally, when they announced this update, I knew it was time to get back into Minecraft again. And, spoiler alert, since they've released this update, I haven't been able to quit playing modern Minecraft. I was the kind of player, like many others, where they come back to the game for 2 to 3 months at a time and then leave it on the shelf to collect dust for another year before another cool update comes out and they rinse and repeat. But since the Caves and Cliffs update, Minecraft's terrain has felt a lot closer to its original image than most of the updates that came before it did. I mean, just look at this Bro, some of these scenes are fucking insane, man. And the other update that is kind of an exception to this pursuit of a more RPG-style game was half of the Wild update, and more in concept than in practice. When they announced the Wild update, they aimed to add ambience to the world and promote the stop and smell the flowers mentality, as opposed to the dungeon raiding mentality that they had been pushing for so long. Although if you remember, the other half was definitely in strong pursuit of the latter, but let's ignore that. And the biggest example of this departure in an RPG style, in my opinion, is definitely the Trails and Tales update. Although archaeology adds more lore to the world, fitting that more RPG style of game that forces ideas onto the player, it was really nice to see Mojang focus on the sandbox aspects of the game to promote players to tell their own stories and create their own lore. All they did was add a handful of cool new blocks and the addition of chiseled bookshelves, which is my personal new favorite addition in Minecraft. I can't tell you how cool the feeling is to be able to have a book and quill and either make a checklist of projects that I want to complete or keep a journal of all the things that have happened on a server and be able to close the book and throw it on a real bookshelf. With all that being said, All of these additions that Mojang have been adding to the game that make it feel more like an RPG or make it feel as though that's the direction they want the game to go in, at the end of the day, it's all optional. You could, for the most part, ignore most of these additions and use Minecraft as the sandbox game it was originally intended to be. And that's really it. That's the key. It's a mindset. I mean, most of the features and systems that existed in this game still exist in this game. With the right mindset, you could still play the first game that Minecraft was in this new game that Minecraft is now. I mean, hell, even I play modern Minecraft in a very classic way, down to the resource pack. If you guys weren't aware, this Golden Days resource pack is the bomb. If you're a fan of old Minecraft and still play modern Minecraft, you need to get this. So, in short, they aren't different games, and maybe I was just overthinking it.